Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Jacobs, and I am the Acting Executive Director of WorkRise. I'm also a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute. And I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to the third installment of our Launching WorkRise event series. For those of you who are just joining the conversation, this is the third of our events. WorkRise is a new national platform for identifying, testing, and scaling bold ideas for transforming the low-wage labor market. Well, we began this project before the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic fallout. Our work has taken on new urgency and new relevance. The pandemic has laid bare how vulnerable workers, particularly those in essential jobs and on the front lines, and their families truly are. So in addition to generating new evidence, WorkRise is also elevating existing knowledge across often siloed groups, creating a shared space for employers, labor advocates, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to learn from one another. And we're spending this week exploring some of the key mechanisms that shape economic opportunity and mobility for low-wage workers, and new ideas and solutions to accelerate both opportunity and mobility. So our conversations over the last few days have covered broad economic context, racial inequity, how skill development and job searching can better serve workers. And today, I'm very excited to be focusing on the intersection between employer practices and worker power, both in the workplace and in public policy. And I want to note we have a terrific group of panelists today, and I'm particularly excited for this conversation, not just because of the topic, but also because this group has been uniquely engaged in making this panel truly useful and exciting. And so I just want to give a shout out to all of the amazing folks you're going to hear from in a few minutes for their willingness to really dig in, both on the substance, but also just for this particular event. So thank you to them. And I think you're really in for a treat. I think there should be a great conversation. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone of a few housekeeping items. Our conversation today is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the WorkRise website, which I encourage you to visit. All attendees are muted, but we encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box at any time. And you can share your thoughts about our discussion on social media using the hashtag WorkRise, which is work and then capital R-I-S-E. And now I'm going to turn it over to today's moderator, Rishia Irumi, who's a technology fellow with the Ford Foundation's Future of Workers initiative. And Rishia, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm really excited to be here today to be participating in the launch of WorkRise and in this conversation. I'll start off by saying that workers in low-wage positions have been among the most vulnerable to the consequences of this pandemic. They are facing reduced hours, layoffs, and uncertain economic futures. But these workers have always been vulnerable, and as the pandemic is bringing into stark relief, many of them are essential to the functioning of the economy and society at large. We are now attuned to the risks they face and the harms disproportionately borne by workers of color. It is clear now than ever that we need solutions that are fast-acting, long-lasting, and as broad as possible. So a key question we need to ask is how we might successfully leverage this moment to take the kind of action we need. Today, we're going to investigate what action could look like and attempt to surface ideas around what might make change possible. We understand this to be the power held by workers themselves and the practices of their employers. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel. We've had lots of great conversations about what this conversation could look like. The first person I would like to introduce is Beth Cobert, who is the CEO of the COO of the Markle Foundation and the Chief Executive Officer of Skillful. Next up is Commissioner Lorelei Salas, who serves at the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection in New York City. We also have Palak Shah, who is the founding director of the NDWA Labs and the Social Innovations Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And we have David Weil, who is Dean and Professor of the Heller School of Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Again, I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I think what I will share is that we have kind of two ways. We're going to be looking in the first section about how we got here and what is at stake. And then in the second section, we'll begin to start looking at what the solutions are. So David, I'd love to turn it to you. What we're seeing today didn't just happen. It's a result of a lot of choices that have been made over a long period of time. So would love it if you could just kind of, in a very short, condensed version, give us a sense of what those policy choices that have been made over time. How have they gotten us to this point such that workers are so vulnerable and at such high risk?
Yeah, thanks, Risha, and thanks to WorkRise for including me. I think, as you point out, it's very important to first understand these are not new issues that have put workers at risk. And in fact, there's been both discussions of future of work incessantly that tend to focus on digital types of platforms as if that's where all of the changes have been. And as you also point out, COVID has made it so abundantly clear some of the changes that have put low-wage workers and workers in precarious positions in particular risk. And it's really not the future of work we should be talking about, it's the present of work. Many of these changes began several decades ago in specific industries who were facing capital market pressures from public capital, from private capital. On one hand, to really focus on what's sometimes called in business discussions, core competencies, what a company is good at, what investors want to get. That pressure to focus on that was often and remains very often accompanied by a pressure to shed work, to shed the kinds of employment relationships we have traditionally had to protect workers and provide benefits to other entities, to other businesses, sometimes as subcontractors, sometimes as third-party providers, sometimes in the forms of things like franchising. And that shifting of work, on one hand, moves the primary employer away from the conditions that affect wages and benefits and mobility and opportunities, even though very often those businesses remain very much in control of the outcomes, the quality, the delivery of services or goods. And that breaking apart, which I've called fissuring, has had pronounced effects on the life of working people. Often by shedding, by subcontracting, outsourcing, it puts greater pressure on those employers who are now providing the employment. They're operating with lower margins, and with lower margins, that means compression on earnings. Unfortunately, very often, those kinds of relationships result in misclassification of workers, classifications of workers as independent contractors. So workers lose the protections from everything from the Fair Labor Standards Act and minimum wage to occupational safety and health protections to social safety net protections like worker compensation and unemployment insurance, leaving those workers, and those workers are disproportionately often people of color, women, immigrants, even more precariously positioned. And also that fissuring, unfortunately, often means that the kinds of historic ladders of mobility that workers, let's say in the old world of automobile industry or in a company like Kodak, might be able to come in as a janitor and kind of work their way up and have opportunities. When you fissure relationships in this way, as we're seeing in more and more industries, those ladders evaporate. And if you're a janitor for a contracting company, even if you're working for a leading employer, you no longer have opportunities to move in that. And that means we have erosion of wages, we have loss of benefits, and we have more and more workers, and again, particularly workers of color, who are facing an eroded and very difficult labor market. That's how we came into this pandemic, and that's being exposed in many, many ways by the pandemic.
Thank you, David. That is very helpful background. Palak, I'm going to turn to you. You work on the front lines with many of the workers who are facing a lot of who have long faced a lot of the challenges that we are encountering. So would love if you could just kind of give us a sense of what workers in low-wage jobs have experienced. How is the COVID recession and pandemic impacting them? And if you could help tease out the implications of that for workers and who come from communities of color.
Definitely. So I agree with David and your assessment that we were already in crisis before COVID. And for us, but also for many other workers living in poverty, the pandemic created a crisis within a crisis. Let me offer you a perspective from the bottom and the invisible part of the economy. And for those of you who may not know, domestic workers are the nannies, house cleaners, and caregivers who take care of us and our homes. At NDWA, we often say that they do the work that makes other work possible. There are about 2.5 million domestic workers in the US, 91% are women. They're disproportionately women of color and immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. And 21% of domestic workers today are Black, compared to 11% of other workers. And this, of course, can be traced back to the ugly legacy of slavery in this country, as some of the earliest domestic workers in this country were enslaved Black women. And so it goes without saying that these are precarious and poverty wage jobs. An Economic Policy Institute report released last May showed that domestic workers are 3 times likely to be living in poverty as other workers. For example, the typical domestic worker is paid median wages of $12 per hour, much less than the other workers who are paid almost $20 per hour. So of course, layered on top of this is that domestic work takes place in the shadows. It is primarily informal and cash-based. And so when COVID hit, it made things even worse. And the situation is completely dire. When the crisis hit, we knew our markets would be completely devastated. So with the help of our friends at the Gates Foundation, we began quickly surveying domestic workers every week through our chatbot, which has more than 225,000 domestic workers engaged. And what's emerged is an incredibly rich and exciting data set, a window into the invisible and informal labor markets, which we're excited to share and offer to the research community as a complement to the more formal economic indicators we rely on. Here's what our surveys in late March and early April showed, where we had 12,000 and 16,000 respondents respectively. 72% of respondents had no jobs for the week beginning in April. 80% of respondents with a high volume of work had no work for the following week. 94% reported that coronavirus-related cancellations were by their client, and that of those that were canceled, facing cancellation, 70% said they didn't know if their clients would give them their jobs back. 77% of the respondents were primary breadwinners. 84% of workers reported that they were not able to afford food for the early weeks of the pandemic. And 55% were unable to pay April's rent. The underlying problems are not new. And in some ways, you can think about domestic workers as some of the country's original gig workers, almost a canary in the coal mine. But pre and post-pandemic, we continue to be in severe crisis. Millions of people, not just domestic workers, are worried about not being able to feed their children, and they are worried about whether they will be homeless next month. Our morality, our humanity, our compassion for our neighbors who are mothers and fathers and children requires us not to ignore what we are seeing, what COVID is shining a light on. And we must not unsee what COVID is helping us very clearly to see.
Paula, thank you for that. I think that's a picture, just a snapshot and window into kind of what really is happening. Beth, I'd like to turn to you. And the question I would love to ask is around how, what is at stake for workers in this moment, for employers in this moment, if they don't deal with these issues. And if you could also begin to give us a view of how employers are beginning to adapt their practices to address some of what Palak has shared.
Sure. Happy to try and respond to those questions. And I think that picture of reality is so important for us to keep in mind, not just in that sector, but as we think across sectors. It's really interesting when you talk to employers, you can make the argument as about What are the benefits of having a workforce that feels that they are financially secure, that feels that their lives are stable, and the business benefits that that can translate into, whether it's better customer service, lower turnover, better productivity, higher safety. All those things are often acknowledged, but they actually aren't measured very often. And those are long-term benefits when employers are facing short-term pressures. And so I think for employers, it's a question about how do you help your employees? How can you help those employees address the very real issues they're facing in their lives while recognizing that those benefits accrue to you as a business, and you've got to find a way to translate between those. We see some employers coming into the picture with that view in mind, and we see others who are not. So you've got to think about employers as a broad group and think about what can be done to get more employers to both recognize these very real benefits and to act on them in a way that makes a difference in the lives of their employees. So what are we seeing companies doing in response to that situation? A couple of examples from different types of employers. The question as employers are facing economic pressure is, what can they do with the talents they have in their workforce, and how can they think more explicitly about taking the talented workers that they have and recognizing the capabilities those individuals bring and can bring to roles as the economy changes, as the future of work arrives today. I like the future of work is now, not in the future. We see some companies taking very proactive stands on that. Two of the partners in Markle's WeWork America Business Network, Duke Energy and Zurich North America, have made commitments to creating internal talent marketplaces. So as the demand and dynamics of their business changes, they are looking with the employees they have and helping them build the training and the skills to move into those new roles. Some companies are doing that, some are not. We also, at the other end of the spectrum here in Colorado, have seen some interesting responses, and one example that might be a model with some small-scale employers. There's a terrific nonprofit here named Work-Life Partnership who we partnered with that brings to companies pay for their services, but it's a nonprofit, resource navigators that help those individual workers deal with the daily stresses in their life, whether those are, and this is aimed at frontline workers, accessing the benefits that individuals are eligible for but don't know how to enroll in, figuring out ways to sort through the complexities of childcare and transportation that get in the way of those workers actually being able to stay focused on the job and delivering. It's a small example of how a company can translate this recognition of the importance of having a workforce that's engaged, that is stable, that has what they need to live their lives, and the business benefits and how they can bring those together. So those kinds of things are starting. We can see those. The question is, I think for all of us here, is how do we make that happen at greater scale?
Beth, thank you for that. And I think you hit on, the key question that I had was, we are seeing examples, but there's always this question of scale. How do you scale it out? I would like to turn to Lorelei, and given the role that you have played, particularly in New York, which was one of the first places that was hardest hit, I would love to get a sense of what you're seeing on the ground in relation to kind of what's happening with workers, what workers are doing, what employers are doing, and would love to also hear what's not working based on your experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this panel. And my co-panelists have already sort of described sort of how we got to where we are now, right? And the efforts that are being made by certain employers. I have to say that for sure in New York City, we have seen a real interest from businesses to try to figure out how, first understand their obligations during this pandemic and understand how they can help their workers, right? But so to give you an example of the response that my team had to put in place pretty soon after the city went on lockdown, we had to stand up a hotline, and we received hundreds of calls from businesses and from workers. And this is something that I believe Palak mentioned. there's even the workers would call us with questions about their rights. We were able to file very few complaints. People had to make decisions about whether to go back to work or continue to work, in many cases in situations that put their safety and health at risk, but at least being able to put food on the table, right? So these are very difficult decisions for workers. And as an agency, and not just my agency, but as part of a city administration that had to respond to the crisis, it really was all hands on deck. So beyond the work that my agency does around worker protection, we had to engage with other city agencies to think about what is the response from the city to address this crisis, and not really put the burden on workers to come forward and report violations. Like I said, there are plenty of employers who are trying to do the right thing, but there's also a lot of information out there. And New York State published a significant number of guidelines for each industry that employers had to abide by in order to reopen safely. And that is a lot of information to understand, especially when you have a large group of employers, small business owners who are also immigrants, right? Who may not be that familiar with the laws in this country. And it really required us to have a presence on the ground. So be out there, going door to door to businesses and in their language, having materials prepared in those languages and making sure that they themselves had the tools they needed to reopen safely. But I have to say that the questions that we were getting from workers were basically, how do I access unemployment insurance benefits? And if I am not eligible for that, is there any other funding available for me to feed my family, to pay my rent? It was devastating to see the degree to which people were so outside the safety net, and how much need there was, right? And then, just as much as you had a lot of people who are undocumented who did not have any sort of benefits, then you had your essential workers who were mostly employed in supermarkets, grocery stores, pharmacies. And in New York City, a great number of them, I think 60% of essential workers were immigrant workers. So again, wages that don't pay you enough money, right, to have savings, probably not a lot of access to benefits. We have a segment of the retail industry that is unionized, but the majority isn't. So for these jobs, if you're putting your health at risk, you don't have health insurance most likely, right? And if something happens to you, you are going to leave nothing behind for your family. So really difficult situation, which actually resulted in very few workers filing complaints on other labor laws that are in place, that New York City has strong scheduling protections for workers in fast food and retail industries. We had very few of any complaints on scheduling violations. Why? Because if you had a job, you just wanted to keep that job, right? We did see, I think finally, as I'm sure you're all aware, the state and the federal governments recognizing how important paid sick leave benefits are, and finally acting out on that, at least in New York State and the federal government, as well as other states and localities. But paid sick leave benefits, it's something that it took a crisis for, to actually see more people be in support and the industry to be in support of those benefits, even though New York City has had a law in place for the last 6 years, and there have been surveys, there's been some research and data gathered that showed that there was really no decrease in productivity or no job losses, right? It's a benefit that makes sense, but it took a real crisis to actually get other governments to act. So, I definitely think that a lot more needs to be done to make sure that we are acting now, that we don't wait for yet another crisis. We're obviously not out of this one, but to keep thinking about those really basic benefits that are so important and should be available to all workers, regardless of any of their status or what industry they work in. And so I think what I would just say, I know that I'm taking too much time now, but what doesn't work is to just, it's not, you have to react so quickly, right? As government agencies, it's really hard sometimes to be nimble and flexible. And we have had to move staff around to learn to do new work. I have a team of inspectors that enforce consumer protection violations. They are the ones who had to be trained to be in the field, checking out on safety and health guidelines. And that is really, it's a huge lift, but it's not business as usual. So you cannot do the same things during a pandemic. You also have to understand that, like right now, you do have employers who are facing real financial distress, right? So in those situations, as an enforcement agency, what do we do? Do we continue to aggressively try to seek every cent that is owed, or do we first focus on forward compliance and correction of the problems? So you have to make difficult decisions that you may not make under normal circumstances, but it does require us doing things very, very differently. I think I'm going to stop there so we have time for the second part.
Thank you, Commissioner Lorelei. I think what I will just share, just listening to all of you, is that the solutions that will come are really an interplay of better policies and enforcement, the rise of high road employer practices, and the power of workers. So I would like us to shift to kind of looking at ideas and solutions. And Paula, I'm going to start with you. We often hear this term, building the power of workers, worker power in the workplace. Would love to hear a little bit about what you've seen. How do we define that? What have you seen work? And how can we ensure that workers are able to build out innovative practices that advance towards greater opportunity for themselves in the workplace?
So first I want to say how grateful I am to Commissioner Salas for the kind of public leadership that she is displaying. It is, it's a really hard time to be a public leader, and we are grateful for everything that you're doing and the way that you're leading. So it's a really insightful question that you're asking, you know, and oftentimes I'm asked, you know, about worker voice and worker power, and I sometimes fear we're interchanging the two quite a bit because they're definitely related, but they're not the same. And so before I kind of dive into that and what I mean by that, I want to acknowledge that workers speaking up in any way in today's climate is risky. Right? We've condoned, and even embraced a culture across this economy where workers fear retaliation. They fear getting fired if they speak up. And for domestic workers, there is no HR department for them to turn to. They don't have the right to collectively bargain. They don't have any of those basic provisions that we've put into place for many workers in the economy. For example, we've heard from our workers that employers, domestic employers, household employers have rehired them, but for less pay, and told the workers that if she left, she would be easily replaced. So when I think about the difference between all of these terms, I think about worker voice. Worker voice is about structuring ways in which workers can give feedback or have input on the job. Worker voice, to me, like, it can take the form of surveys or town halls, and it's a bunch of practices that enlightened employers, conscientious employers naturally gravitate toward. Worker voice means you can speak, but honestly, when you strip it all down, no one has to listen to you, right? So for example, NDWA, even my presence on this panel, I'm exercising tremendous worker voice on this panel, and I speak on behalf of the domestic workers. We exercise our voice about the safety net, about the COVID crisis, and about portable benefits. And in some ways, we can think about worker voice as a way to articulate worker problems and even recommendations, with the hope that the employer or others who have power, with their goodwill, will voluntarily take action or make changes. It fundamentally exists, in my mind, within the terrain of employer power. Worker power, on the other hand, is about solving worker problems, and worker power is more about changing the trajectory of what has been in response to the needs of workers. And it's, to me, when I think about, okay, what's the distinction? Worker power is about workers fundamentally resetting the terrain. So for example, domestic workers desperately, especially in this COVID crisis, need access to benefits and a safety net, to the way that the commissioner was naming. And worker power from our movement was exercised, for example, when we changed the law in Philadelphia last year, giving every domestic worker the right to paid time off for every hour that she works in the economy. Domestic workers shouldn't have to rely on winning the good boss lottery, right? Though we love and appreciate good bosses. At NDWA, we of course value any opportunity to exercise worker voice, but our goal is to build worker power, not narrowly for our industry, but more broadly in the political economy.
Thanks, Palak. And I really appreciate how you've kind of created those distinctions between voice and power, because I think that sometimes the voice could be a set of practices that are brought up into the workplace.
They are great. It's not a critique of those practices at all.
Yeah.
We need it all.
Yeah.
But I think fundamentally we've shifted so in one direction in the way that David was talking about, that we need a counterforce.
Yeah. So David, I'm going to turn to you. And I would love to kind of really think about this question of upward mobility and increased opportunity, and look at how, what roles employers can play in actually reshaping the way they act within the economy. And how does that relate to policy change? Thinking about this trajectory of worker power, employers, and policy.
Yeah, let me answer that by building on what Palak was talking about. I always learn from Palak whenever I have the good fortune to have conversations involving her, and I think that distinction she made is really important. When I think about the whole issues of mobility and opportunity, we have to start with the fact that labor market protections, labor markets are inherently unequal. There's unequal bargaining power based in labor markets, that workers always have less power in those relationships, and particularly low-wage workers, immigrant workers, workers of color have been put in a particularly less empowered position. And in fact, why do we have labor market laws in the first place? If you go back to the early 1900s and read both the advocates who put in place legislation, judges, people opining on it, recognize the inequality of bargaining power and the need for government policies to, in part, address that. Some of the long-standing imbalances powers, as Palak pointed out earlier, are because even into the 20th century, the legacy of racism carried forward, and groups, Black workers, were expressly excluded even from some of our early workplace protections, like the Fair Labor Standards Act. But that being said, this number one, we got to go back to the fact that the imbalance of power requires us to have a public presence and the kind of enforcement that Lorelei was talking about. Secondly, then, when we think about worker power and what that means, I think we come back to really two mechanisms that workers can express their power. One is through voice, but I would certainly add the broader definition, or the power plus voice definition that Palak was talking about. And second is what's called exit. I mean, the ability to leave a job. The problem is, in all of those dimensions, workers have been put in an increasingly weakened positions as unions have declined, as laws have come in place that have made things like class action suits or the ability to complain more and more difficult for working people, where you have the profusion of non-compete agreements that tie the hands of workers. All of those things erode a worker's ability to either leave, exit, say, I'm going to find other opportunities, again, particularly dramatic for low-wage workers. And they erode power and voice, the ability to step forward and say, not only I, but with other working people, am not going to tolerate these conditions. So what does that say? It says to think about addressing the current situation specifically to COVID and much more on a longer term scale. We need to, number one, have government set those boundaries again. There's too many working people who have fallen out of the protections of government policies and set the boundaries of acceptable practice. Number two, we need to enliven worker institutions that provide voice and power in the way Pollack was talking about. That's what traditionally unions do. What is exciting is new organizations like NDWA are finding new ways to create institutional independent ways of workers exercising voice and power. And in that context, then you get to the employer side of the situation. I agree with what Beth said. There isn't one employer group, one business group. There are different types of employers in the world. Unfortunately, I had the honor, not unfortunately, I had the honor of serving as the head of the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor in the Obama administration. And I certainly encountered progressive employers who wanted to do the right thing, who were doing things exceeding what the law required. Unfortunately, there are a lot of employers out there who are not playing that game. And the competitive impact of those employers is why you have to have strong government and strong institutions. With that in place, that's the environment where employers can work productively, can create the kinds of progressive types of new policies that Beth was talking about. In that environment with stronger worker institutions, you can have the kinds of labor management partnerships that have been shown to both improve the conditions of working people and improve the profitability of enterprises who are engaged in it. But you need the foundation of strong protections to deal with the inequality of bargaining power, both from the government and strong worker institutions, to allow those employers to grow, the employers who comply with the law to be not allowed to compete on that basis, facing the kinds of challenges Lorelei described. And in that way, moving forward towards more progressive, better conditions that not only meet, but exceed the kinds of things we prescribe in the law.
David, thank you for kind of creating a view of what those solutions could look like. Commissioner Lorelei, I'm going to turn to you. We have seen and we know that passing good policies are one thing, but on the other side is the implementation and enforcement of those policies. So as if we were able to kind of identify the right set of policies that could improve the lives of working people, what will it take to enforce and ensure that they're adhered to?
So that we could spend like hours talking about that, but obviously we don't have that much time. So a couple of things. Let me say that in New York City, I feel like we're really honored to have not only like strong advocates and strong worker centers like NDWA and other groups, but also very progressive leadership, and we're being able to pass like new legislation that addresses issues like in the gig economy, that addresses scheduling issues in certain industries. But if you don't resource enforcement appropriately, you don't put enough money into enforcement, those rights just don't become real for people, right? And they are great words in statutes, and it means nothing else. I had many years ago, I was working in the Department of Labor when domestic workers won the Bill of Rights in New York State, and it was an enforcement challenge. to actually make sure domestic workers are getting paid minimum wage and overtime when they're working in homes, which are often, places where we tend to fear going into, right, as government agents, but they're workplaces. So thinking about not just having the rights, but how do you make sure that that case, from the moment that there's a complaint or you proactively decide to investigate a case, that there's a resolution at the end of that case, at the end of that arc of investigation, is so important. And it's not fun or like groundbreaking. It's not sexy, but it's work that needs to be done. So this year we were able to get a couple of huge victories for my agency in obtaining the right to the ability to docket a judgment against a business that did not comply with the laws. I mean, not having that, you can never really have impact because there's no real consequence for a violation of a labor law. And so there are just those things that take a lot of time, a lot of work, and may not feel like you're creating new, like, breaking new ground, but it's important. So the enforcement piece of it is huge. And we've actually had, this goes to along what David was saying, we've had industry group associations and groups that have said, we want to support you in that, and you getting the enforcement powers that you need, because our members are already subject to a lot of rules and regulations, and you know what they are, and you're requiring them to comply with all these things. But what about those that are outside and are not complying with anything? They're undercutting our members, right? So we want you to have those powers. So I think that there's a way in which you can work with the employers, the high road employers who are trying to do the right thing. Many states and localities are actually investing funds into co-enforcement, right? And working with groups, with worker centers, with labor unions to make sure that there's one, access to groups of workers who may not naturally be comfortable coming and approaching government and filing complaints with our agencies. But these groups, are much more permanent in their communities, right? They're able to actually bridge that gap between our agencies and their communities. They bring the language skills. I mean, it doesn't relieve us from the obligation to have, language access and all of that, but supporting the outreach work that groups like NDWA and others can do is something that we should all be investing in. In New York City, we haven't had the money yet to do that, but we have tried to work with groups where we know there are industries in which there are serious issues, like home health aid industry, for instance, in New York City, and making sure if there's an organizing effort by certain groups, oftentimes you are able to actually speak to more workers in that industry and try to create like industry change, right? Really like raise the standards in an entire industry, right? It's also another fair way to look at it. You're not just picking one employer, but you're really looking at that entire industry and trying to help raise the standards in that industry. And I believe there are other things that you can do, like build in into the law the ability for certain organizations to actually file complaints for violations of labor laws as complainants, right? So they can file a complaint as an organization. That also relieves the burden from individual workers from having to come forward, who in many cases are, afraid of retaliation, and having a very strong stance against retaliation. I mean, that's something that I know we probably all have seen recent sort of data from OSHA and their really insufficient response to complaints from workers and complaints about retaliation. And that's something that I think it's so important for us to prioritize. So I think though all of those measures can help, but again, you still need to have the bodies, the people who are going to do this work. And we are now, for instance, in the position again of having to draw from other parts of the agency to support the enforcement, but you need to do what you need to do. So.
Yeah. Thank you for just giving us that range of solutions. I would like to turn to Beth. And so we've seen what can happen on the policy side. We've seen a little bit about what workers can do. Would love for you to touch on what might incentivize more employers, large and small, to begin to take on a lot of these good practices. And how do we ensure that those practices address a lot of the inequities that we have seen across race, gender, disability more broadly?
So thanks for the question, and thanks to my fellow panelists for teeing up the importance of some of these issues around worker voice and worker power and effective policy and effective enforcement of policy. So I will take the question as framed, which is, beyond that, what do you do? And not negating the importance of those factors. To me, this is really about trying to move employers, let me call it, from intent to action. So from I'd like to be the winner of the good boss lottery, as Paula described it, but I don't know how to get there. And I think there's a lot of value and change that can happen by making those pragmatic changes easier and simpler so that it becomes the natural way you do things as opposed to taking a lot of work along the way. And so there's a couple things, I think, of things that can help move that along. One is when we talk about calling people into this process, lots of employers, particularly in recent months, have made statements about their intent, whether it's intent to address longstanding racial equities in employment and advancement opportunities in their companies. We can't forget that those have happened, and those need to be measured and tracked the way companies track the way they do everything else. How do they actually live on those? But how do you also give employers and help them understand that there are practical ways to do things? If they want to make changes in who they hire, what can they do practically to change the way they do that? Where do they look for talent? How do they describe jobs in ways that actually reflect what they really need and the talents that groups that have been overlooked in the past really do bring? So a lot of the work that we've done and that we've seen have impact is trying to make those tangible changes happen in companies large and small. How do you change job postings so that their language is focused on skills and capabilities and not unnecessary credentials, and aren't written in language that we have seen discourages groups who may have been underrepresented from applying? Through our work at Markle and Skillful, we've actually built a job posting generator that can do that for companies, has made it available. Focusing on these practical tools is actually a core part of the work of what we're doing now with the Rework America Alliance, which is trying to bring together a broad variety of organizations in collaboration in response to the economic crisis to help workers move into good in-demand jobs, employers and advocacy groups and others, and to create tools that enable this to happen at scale. So what can you do to change those day-to-day practices? How can you encourage the HRIT companies that really are the backbone through which people hire to change the default so that they focus on these issues and not on credentials, which we know are unevenly distributed if you're looking at formal education based upon the way that has disadvantaged people of color in the past. So for me, as I think about what can be done, it is again about this moving from concept, I want to do this, to action and the practical things you can do to get to that point while we still have these very important debates about policy, enforcement, and voice.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we're about to go to our Q&A, but before we do that, I would like to ask each of you to name one big, bold idea about how labor markets can be shifted such that there's greater opportunity for workers. This is a key goal of WorkRise. So if you were betting on kind of a big idea, what would that look like? Beth, I'd like to turn to you and then we'll turn to the others. I know you've shared something, but what's that big idea?
Always hard to go first in the answer to the question. Let me focus on one idea, recognizing we probably need more than one. We believe in the future of work, there's going to be an ongoing need for training that individuals can really bring their full self, both to have access to training and the support they need to complete it. How do we think about incentivizing that training and incentivizing employers to do that, particularly employers who are already creating good jobs, so that those incentives go to the companies that are supporting their workforce and enabling them to do more. We think that will provide a broad-based incentive, not just for training, but for the kind of practices we think are needed that reflect some of the views you've been talking about here.
Right. Lorelei, what would be a big, bold idea?
Okay, that's a very high standard. I'm not sure if I have big and bold, but
Yeah.
I will say one thing that I think is super important, especially now as hopefully our governments keep thinking about how to provide appropriate relief to our small business community, to our workers, to really make sure that you marry the sort of like the incentives, the relief to high road practices. And so, for instance, one thing that the city in New York has been doing is this restaurant program where we are, these are, I think, either low interest loans or they're grants, but it's about $30,000 per restaurant. We have about 100 restaurants in those neighborhoods where we've seen the highest numbers of infection by COVID-19, which are also the same neighborhoods where we have a lot of Black and brown residents. These restaurants were given up to $30,000 each to hire unemployed or underemployed residents from New York City, who would then get paid at least the minimum wage, but up to $20 is what the city would reimburse the employer for. That's really to incentivize hiring people at a full minimum wage, now not taking the tip credit that restaurants can do, but also making sure that we are addressing the issues of COVID-19 has put so many people on the unemployment rosters. So that is one way in which government can make sure to, like, you know, obviously help rescue our restaurants in New York City, but also incentivize that they, they put in place high road practices that would bring workers full, like, minimum wage and employment status. Like I said, they also have a requirement to give a certain number of free meals to community members. So it's really a great program. It's not big and bold, it's simply sensible, but that's what I got today.
Thank you. David?
So I think if it's big and bold, one way to think about it, and Lorelei mentioned it earlier, is you think about how could you change the way an industry functions. I always think about these things in terms of individual industries. And I would take the example of an industry that at a certain point of time actually had solved a problem of workers who were highly mobile, who often were being employed by small employers who didn't have the ability or the incentive to invest in training, where left to its own devices, wages fell to very low levels. And that's the construction industry. And I think what happened in that industry could be transformative in many industries. I think this is part of what NDWA has thought about in a deep way. And that is, how do you bring together the forces I talked about, the power of government to set policies, the power of worker institutions to be at the table, and then the ability of employers to shape policies together. In the construction industry, you had in places with high union density, training systems, apprenticeship systems, health and welfare funds that were being paid into by multiple employers, workers who were often moving and do move between employers, but that became sustainable because you had a concerted set of policies from public sector that created an environment where then you could have unions organizing and working with employers to kind of build a sustainable system. I'd like to think about those kinds of opportunities in the context of different industries where you could really bring that to scale.
Great. Palak.
Okay, so mine's kind of more like a concept, but then maybe a little bit of a prototype that's emerging from us. So it's still shocking to me that this is a bold idea, but I guess mine is work is work is work is work. And we all need when we need a safety net that essentially protects every hour of work. So what I mean by that is, obviously today's safety net was designed for the most part for a workforce that doesn't look like domestic workers, It's more structured for a traditional kind of what we think about as a 9-to-5 job, and all 40 of your hours are in one workplace. And I think for us, that's just not the reality for domestic workers who may be working more than 40 hours, 40, 50, 60, 70 hours, but in 40 different homes. And so it's like parsed out across a whole bunch of different workplaces. And so, you know, I think when we think about that problem and what the workers in our movement have been telling us, that they've worked for 10 years without ever taking a day off, never being able to be able to go on a field trip with their children because that means a day of lost work versus having paid time off. And so we created ALIA, which is our first attempt at creating an expanded safety net. A lot of people are talking about it in the same breath as portable benefits, but basically our vision is to design an experiment with an expanded safety net that provides benefits for every hour that's worked, regardless of where it's worked.
Thank you. We're almost at time, but I do want to see if we can get to some of the audience questions. So I think the first one is really around the question of employers' incentives. A lot of public employers are accountable to shareholders, and often that drives kind of the business models and whatnot. So how do we reshape that? How do we get into the question of how they operate within the market and the ways in which they're answerable to their shareholders, such that we can ensure greater opportunity for workers? I would love to kind of quickly turn that question to David to see if there's anything from a policy perspective, and then Beth would love to hear from you.
So I would say, I think it's the right question to ask. I think there are people who have talked about trying to change the way capital markets work to have a more long-term perspective where you could invest in that. I think that's a very hard thing to pull off. And I think given that, we have to look at, again, setting boundaries, sustainable boundaries that protect workers in a context where otherwise these pressures will continue to push. And we're seeing this in the platform economy in ways that disadvantage working people. It's thinking hard about broader set of policies adapted to the workforce as it exists to provide those protections much more comprehensively as an important part of that response.
I think that changing capital markets is a long-term and complex process, but I think if you look at corporate boards today and the issues that they hear from, whether it's from their institutional shareholders who are calling them out more on some of these topics and asking what they're doing besides making statements, looking for things that can be measured, I think you see some more of that coming into the conversation in the boardroom where you're thinking about how these issues are addressed. And how you can explicitly make those statements, demonstrate those benefits. So you're seeing some more pressure and some more of this view around how do you think about the long-term health and welfare of a corporation, which is tied to the health and welfare of its employees.
Thank you. I think the next question I'd like to pose, and this will also go to Palak and Beth. You both have seen a lot of innovation, like business model innovation and worker innovation in this space. Several of our participants are asking how they can get involved, sort of both on the worker side and kind of with the work that Beth, you're doing with Skillful. So what would be some ways that people who are eager to get involved can do so?
Go ahead, Beth.
I will put in the chat, but I think we are trying to find ways to reach out through Skillful and the Rework America Alliance that we'd love to have folks engage in. We have 30 states plus the District of Columbia involved in the Skillful State Network. The Rework America Alliance, which we launched this summer, has a broad range of folks, and I will put in the chat our landing page where you can sign up. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to get ideas because it's a problem, and we do need the kind of innovation things that we talked about if we're actually going to make a difference. So I will put that in the chat.
I think we are in a time where we need a intense amount of intellectual energy and innovation, not because it's unclear what we need to do, but I do think that there are real problems that are hard to solve, to the ways in which the commissioner was talking about the challenges, for example, of enforcement. You know, I speak a lot to Silicon Valley, but also out against Silicon Valley. It's kind of like a dance that we're doing here. And on the one hand, it's incredible the amount of energy and innovation that's emerged, where you can click, 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 and a car shows up, you know, or you can get your hair blow dried at your house, right? Or a domestic worker comes over. But I often wonder what it would mean if we could find the right incentives and capital structures and in like kind of ways of funding innovation that harness and like turn all that creative energy towards actually solving the problems that we're talking about, like problems of job quality, challenges of enforcement. And you know, our innovation lab has a running hypothesis that technology will play a role in all of that. That technology is essentially a tool, right? And that we can harness the power of that technology, especially in a disaggregated labor market like ours, to be in service of improving the quality of jobs in our sector, not just for us, but for others in similar conditions as well. So if you're an employer of domestic workers, a really clear thing you can do, I put it in the chat, is sign up at myalia.org and actually participate in the voluntary safety net that we are starting to build for domestic workers, and show that you are winning the Good Boss Lottery. But I think for those of you who are in different localities, we are wanting to move this idea from a voluntary safety net to a mandated safety net. For all kinds of workers. And you can get in touch with me to figure out which localities we're doing that in. I think we need partnerships with technologists, we need partnerships with investors, we need partnerships with legislators if we want to actually, especially in this COVID crisis, think about what does it mean to expand the safety net to every hour worked by every person in this economy. Thank you.
And Lorelei, I know that you have done some innovative work, particularly in the restaurant industry. Is there any information that we could that you could share that will help people understand kind of what are potential policy innovations and models for that? That might be useful.
So I should have mentioned too, you know, the funding that you know, we needed to actually put up this program, the restaurant revitalization program, took up like $3 million, and a lot of that was private funding, right? So we certainly are relying on innovators who want to be creative and think about how to, you know, help New York City come back, right? So there are different groups of like business, industry, and labor that get together and are trying to solve for these issues right now. So I don't actually have a link right now, but I do believe that a lot of our efforts right now are going through the Mayor's Fund in New York City. So if you go to nyc.gov and look for the Mayor's Fund, they're helping us to figure out sort of like where are the needs, which agencies have come up with like certain programs that they think are new, creative, interesting, and could have a lot of appeal, and then helping to make sure that we're funding the right projects. And I can put it on in the chat, but it's, you know, like I said, it's really the one thing that I think has come out that is really good about the challenges in New York City is that our different agencies, we've been able to really break these silos a lot more and do a lot more work together as is appropriate and is needed. So it's more centralized right now in terms of the different solutions that are being put together.
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank you for such a rich conversation, each and every one of you. It's been a joy to be here today. I also want to thank our participants for joining us. I know we've gone a little over time, so we'll close now. But before I do that, I would like to encourage you to join the final event of the WorkRise series launch. Tomorrow's event is going to provide us 360 perspective on what workers need to thrive. And I hope that it's going to build on a lot of what we've heard today. So once again, thank you for participating, and thanks to our excellent panelists.
Thank you.